welcome to this bonus episode of the Blooms and Barnacles podcast. I am thrilled to be here today with Katherine Ebury. Katherine is a senior lecturer in modern literature at the University of Sheffield. I had the privilege to see her speak at the International James Joyce Symposium at the University of Glasgow this summer, which she co-organized. I also had a chance to read her upcoming paper entitled On Misogyny and the Critical Reception of Molly Bloom, which is what we're going to chat about today. Katherine, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of the podcast.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for your kind introduction there.
Thanks. And before we get into your paper today, I do want to issue content warnings to anyone's listening out there. We will be touching on topics related to misogyny, gender essentialism, and sexual harassment. So if that's not something you're feeling today, it's okay to skip an episode every now and then, I guess. Katherine, I just really enjoyed, I want to say, your talk at the symposium. There were a few that really just lit me up intellectually. That sounds so overwrought to say, but it really did. It was really exciting to listen to you talk because in researching the podcast, the topic you touched on, which is misogyny and critical books and papers and things related to Joyce's works, it's something that I've kind of dealt with just on my, by my lonesome when I'm sitting here reading things for the podcast. I've had papers where, especially with things around Molly, where it gets uncomfortable. It can get very slut-shamey, I guess, and I have never quite known how to approach that. Listening to you speak in Glasgow made me aware that other people are thinking about the same thing, and I don't expect you to have a solution to this problem, but you had some very insightful ways of looking at it. I took a quote here from your paper that I really felt summed up my experience just researching for the podcast with relation to Molly and Ulysses and Joyce scholarship. It says, a focus on the critical history of Penelope means to an extent entering a chamber of horrors. I like that line, so I include it in here. So yeah, misogyny and Joyce scholarship is something that I've definitely encountered on my own. It tends to be more so in older sources, but from your point of view, how prominent is misogyny in Joyce scholarship, especially with regards to the Penelope episode of Ulysses, and what form does this misogyny take in commentary around Ulysses?
Oh, thanks, Kelly. Thanks also for reflecting on your experience of being a reader, of the text, but also of the commentary. And I think it is true that the past misogyny today in Joyce studies, it still offers this kind of shaping force in scholarship, because new scholars will find this material quite easily. You pick it up in a secondhand bookshop and you read it. And I think it's maybe different to the quote that you read, like with some hindsight. It is like entering a chamber of horrors, but actually you're already there in the chamber of horrors, like before you know it. You're reading quite, dated scholarship, but it feels welcoming. It feels that you're understanding the text better when using it. Hugh Kenner, it was a great scholar, did illuminate our understanding of Ulysses, and then suddenly, a curtain opens and you realize that you're in a room that has a chamber of horrors inside of it, I suppose, to extend the kind of metaphor that drew you. Quite often the tone just sort of subtly changes when critics are dealing with Molly, and you start to sort of, the hairs on the back of your neck go up as you realize that this critic who seemed to speak to you about Joyce from a distance of time, they might actually, have some views that we wouldn't be comfortable with. It's really difficult because these books, as I was saying, that they're easy to get, they're useful, they're cheap, there are tons of them on eBooks and Amazon, and you read them before you're aware really of what the stakes are of reading them, I guess. Encountering Molly's voice and perspective is already a shock to readers of Ulysses, even if they weren't dealing without the scholarship. And that's by Joyce's design. She's appending all the previous versions of her offered by the male characters and by Bloom in particular. But past critics often dealt with that shock poorly, let's say. And present critics and readers struggle when encountering this archive of Joyce criticism on Penelope to do new things. I think it is just a sort of a limiting factor. Yeah.
we've kind of alluded to that there are more what you and I think have both termed a misogynistic approach to criticism around Molly specifically. What does that look like when you encounter it in the wild? You don't have to have a very precise example, but what are the topics that come up that you would categorize as misogynistic?
Yeah, I mean, there are some tropes that I address, in the paper that you heard and the article that you read. My approach has been influenced very much by a past critic called Katherine Ebury, and she was writing in the 1990s. And she dealt with a couple of different tropes that are main tropes, I would say, and then there might be other things that would come up for us in conversation. So first, the idea of Molly as an earth goddess figure, as an earth mother, as very physical and very material. And then the second idea, which followed on from the first, is that she's promiscuous, she's a whore, she's kind of an nymphomaniac, I suppose. Both of those tropes have in common this idea that she's not governing her sexuality appropriately, so the earth mother idea, earth goddess, sounds flattering, it sounds beautiful, but it was a way of kind of trying to tame Molly, like the difficulty of the Penelope episode, and say, what seems to us, we're thinking of critics in the 20s and 30s when Joyce's work was subject to censorship. What might seem to us like needing to be censored is actually beautiful and transformative and is about nature. That was their kind of way of getting out of an idea of Joyce's work as kind of smutty, dirty. Like, at the same time, obviously it is still essentialist, and it's something that we would struggle with today. And then obviously the second iteration of that idea is even more problematic, just thinking of her in really censorious terms. Once Joyce's reputation was safe, once, Joyce's work was being studied in universities, sort of separating Molly off and being like, well, Bloom is a nice guy and Molly is a monster. The language is sort of that of monstrosity, I suppose. Yeah. When
you say refer to something as essentialist, what do you mean by that?
I suppose I mean about thinking about gender, that it's very kind of focused on like the facts of gender. So Molly is a woman, therefore she has breasts and a womb, and they're very important to her and crucial to her identity, as opposed to a more kind of like porous or open view of gender that's come about since writers like Judith Butler, theorists like Judith Butler. And while we're often doing really interesting kind of queer readings of gender and sexuality in Joyce, I think misogyny is still sort of there, like alongside those cooler, newer approaches.
Has there been pushback within academic circles against those, more feminist or queer readings of Ulysses? Is that something that's controversial within Joyce scholarship, like at the moment? Because I know in society at large, those are still very controversial topics. Within academic circles, is that the same case?
Not to the same extent, I don't think so. I think feminist scholars and queer scholars and people working in those fields, whether they're female or queer, will do really interesting work, and their work will be accepted and valued, and they'll get to give talks and to do keynotes. They will be sort of celebrated by the community. At the same time, there is like a parallel track of more conservative reading that is also kind of celebrated, where we do think of these past critics as being still great scholars, and we celebrate them. And also sometimes when a scholar will slip into like a more conservative view of gender or sexuality, often we'll just let that be, we won't challenge that. So it is like that there are parallel kind of tracks of working with Joyce. And you might add to that, like a kind of formalist strand that's like just about the text, and a historicist strand that's very much about like history and specific events, and then the different theory strands that would sort of feminism or queer sexuality, those would fall in that area, I guess. And we all tolerate each other, you know, but it means that sometimes we might be tolerating misogyny occasionally, or just it's there like unexamined, or it's uncomfortable, we don't want to deal with that, we put it away.
I find with readings that focus just on the text, in my own research, I've found things that I feel like are going astray in a way that again portrays Molly as sort of deviantly promiscuous. And the first thing that comes to mind is in Ithaca, there's a list of supposed suitors of Molly's. But if you look at what Molly says, the only time she's ever stepped on Bloom is that afternoon. But I've found a lot of sources in like James Joyce Quarterly and that will talk about Molly's many suitors. And when you look into them, some of them are like low-grade sexual assault or like, you know, being groped or things against her will. And I'm wondering if that is something that is persistent within discussion of Penelope and Molly in particular, or if that is something that's faded out from the discussion in academic circles.
Yeah, this is very tricky. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, just to focus first on the idea of the list of suitors, let's say, yeah, these are ideas that Bloom has about his wife, and these are places where he feels jealousy, I suppose. But as you're saying, Kelly, like the lists of names include people who are inappropriate with her, where there's no evidence that she does anything or not. You know, Lenehan in a carriage, kind of jostling against her, and she did. It's clear that she didn't like that and didn't act on it. You know, she's not been unfaithful with Lenehan. And she's looking, you know, beyond the text for opportunities to be unfaithful. You know, she's interested in Stephen, she's interested in seeing Boylan again. But Joyce designed Molly's adultery on the 16th of June 1904 to be a key event in the novel. And obviously, if she's always committing adultery, then that really undermines some of the meaning of what happens in Joyce's text.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of, you were also asking about, you know, just what do we do with that, I suppose.
Yeah, what that's the big question that hangs over this whole conversation. What do we do, Catherine? What do we do?
Yeah, I mean, as you were saying, my paper in Glasgow was about sort of like describing a problem, you know, and in the question and answers, I did propose solutions, but they're not silver bullet kind of solutions, you know.
I don't know that there is a silver bullet. If you could solve misogyny, like, you know, you would be a hero for the age. Like, this is a question that I think every institution is asking itself. So,
yeah, I mean, the kinds of things that I was proposing were, you know, to certainly think about and cite this past criticism less, you know, to move on from it. Not for it to like stop existing because people are going to pick it up. I think one reason that I wrote this article and gave the paper was sort of so that people will have something to Google. Like that's why it's got such an obvious title. So someone has picked up a book, you know, a new reader of Joyce. They picked up like Kenner or Harry Levin or even something more recent, and they're a bit uncomfortable. Where do they go? And so I wrote like an article with an obvious title that will come up on Google search, and hopefully kind of help by like historicizing, by describing, by suggesting ways that, you know, that it's problematic, this discourse. So yeah, I was suggesting that we'd reflect more, that we'd cite less. I think overall it is useful. I found it useful to reflect on how my own perspective on the text has been shaped by that misogynistic reading that I did 20 years ago when I was a student, I guess. It has been cathartic for me to write about this stuff and to put it all in its place. And I hope it will help others to just have this history. And then when you have a history, like, you know the things and it's not so much in the present, perhaps. Yeah.
So one thing that occurs to me while, sometimes while I'm reading these older sources, and certainly something I reflected on while reading your writing, Catherine, is there's misogyny present in the critical material, but is it possible that, shall we say, the call is coming from inside the house? Is it reacting to misogyny that's present in Joyce's work? I think Joyce sometimes had some not great views about women. He's, I think, better than many people of his day, but there's some dark stuff there. So are people reacting to something that's present in the source material, I guess is my question.
That's an interesting question, and I suppose it's necessary. I mean, I'd sort of set that aside for my paper, but I have, of course, thoughts on it. I guess where I most addressed it in my paper, where I was talking about Marian Idey's work on Joyce's intellectual women, where Joyce depicts intellectual women, other characters who go alongside Molly, but they're different from her, like Molly Ivors or Beatrice Justice. Intellectual women in Joyce's text get a bit of short shrift. They're important, but they also seem quite kind of shrewish. And that does fit alongside some of Joyce's statements about intellectual women, I suppose. I guess we'd also want to, you're talking about the source material, we'd have to go all the way back to the Odyssey as well, wouldn't we? Where Joyce's source material, ancient as it is even more, let's say, dated, but let's also say old. In the main version of the Odyssey, the fidelity of Odysseus's wife Penelope is her most important trait, isn't it? That's the Penelope that's handed down to us. But the secondary trait is that she's very resourceful, she's creative, she's weaving and unweaving her tapestry. The conclusion of the Odyssey is quite unresolved in relation to misogyny, in that Odysseus kills all the suitors for daring to desire his wife, and for the risk to Penelope's fidelity that we see.